All right, so let's start this morning with this. The man accused of opening fire at the White House Correspondents Dinner on Saturday has officially been charged. Cole Allen is facing 2 firearm counts and attempting to assassinate President Trump. It comes as officials release new details about his actions leading up to the attack.
For more perspective on this, we're joined by Jeff James, a retired assistant special agent in charge at the U.S. Secret Service. I really appreciate you joining us. I have to ask you, based on your experience, at one point you were assigned to the personal detail for President George W. Bush. How do you better secure an event like this, where you've got the president, the VP, you have other administration officials? Because, Vlad and I, we walked into that hotel and there wasn't really any security. That sort of surprised us.
Well, when you say there wasn't any security, let's make sure we're separating the vetting process from security. So I would guess that maybe while you were on a list somewhere and nobody necessarily checked your tickets, that you did go through metal detectors and you had to be screened that way for weapons prior to entering the event. The Secret Service, this is something people don't understand, that we don't get involved in the process of inviting or uninviting people to events where the president is. If the president sees fit to invite someone, we don't uninvite them unless we find something in their background that's bothersome, or unless they would try to enter with a weapon. So we screen for weapons. It's up to the White House and the host committee to decide who actually gets invited.
So, Jeff, what would it look like if the White House Correspondents' Dinner in the future, if it were still held at the Washington Hilton, if we elevated this to a top level, whatever the protocol is that is the highest that we would use for an inauguration, for example, or the Super Bowl? Would that mean that guests even staying at the hotel would be screened? In other words, yeah, we did go through mags when we got into the ballroom area, but I think what Kelly was talking about is when we got into the hotel, we just had to show our invitation to get into some of the parties and things happening in and around the hotel.
Right. So there's kind of 2 answers to that question. One is to understand how we build out a site. We look at where the president's going to be, and we build out the security from the center out. We don't necessarily close businesses. You mentioned the Super Bowl. We can't tell 100,000 people that the president's going now, tear up your tickets, you can't come, right? We just find out where he's going to be. We cordon off that area and we build the security around it. We don't want to get in the way of commerce. This is a working hotel. People may have been staying there for a week, and for us to say, hey, you got to clear out until the president's gone, seems a little unfair. Now, would this rise to the level of an NSSE, like you're indicating? That's something that's decided by the Secretary of Homeland Security. Yeah, that would change the protocols. It would also change the amount of assets that were there and things like that. So at that point, they would have to convince that the private ownership of the hotel to shut down for a certain amount of time, but it certainly would change the protocols if it was an NSSE.
Do you think that something like this, that we know happens every year and the president and other officials often attend, should be moved to something that is more securable, let's say like a convention center? Because I've covered a lot of events where the president has been there, and it's always the sweep. Secret Service comes in, they do the full sweep the night before, and then we load in our gear, and it's a very secure site, but there isn't another event or business happening there.
Yeah, but yeah, you are correct. There are other venues that might be better, but I also want to point out that the security mechanism Saturday night worked. This gentleman never penetrated the secure area. He was stopped at the middle perimeter. He never got even onto the same floor as the president, and then the communication that happened down to the details and from the time the shots were fired till the time they were moving the president was about 12 seconds. So I also want to point that out, that while this, from the outside looking in, might seem unusual that this man got to the metal detectors, that's what the metal detectors are there for, to stop that threat away from where the president is before a bad guy could get within handgun range or rifle range of him.
Jeff, one of the questions that I had, so I had 2 thoughts when I was in that ballroom after the president was whisked away by Secret Service. First thought was, okay, we should be relatively safe because there are Secret Service agents crawling all over the ballroom. But then I thought, well, no, their priority is the president, the administration, cabinet officials. Those people are now gone. What if there had been somebody else we don't know, like another threat in that room? So the question, what I'm trying to get at, I guess, is we understand that the Secret Service is there essentially to protect the president of the United States. If somebody had gotten into that hotel before they even got to the ballroom, he or she could have done a lot of damage to people just milling about in the hallways at the different parties. That isn't the priority of the Secret Service, right? Just so I understand. That would be local law enforcement or the FBI or some other agency.
Well, no, that's a great question. And what I'll tell you is if you look at the video again and you look at the video of the aftermath, you're going to see Secret Service poststanders are still not only in the ballroom, but also all around the hotel. Not everybody runs out with the president because a couple of things. One, just what you pointed out, there could be a secondary attack, but also now we have a crime scene that we need to preserve. So not everybody runs out. And again, like I said, if you would look at the video, because that's one of the things I noticed myself was that the poststanders at the back of the ballroom by the double doors, sets of double doors, were still in place even after the president left. Really
quickly, Jeff, the president wanted to continue. He told Weijia Jiang, our colleague and also the president of the White House Correspondents Association, that the show must go on. But Weijia came back out and told us that there are protocols that the Secret Service has, and it just can't happen. A, what are those protocols? And B, could the president just say, well, still, I'm the commander in chief, I want to do it?
You know, I guess he could, but I would hope that the cooler heads around him would allow our argument to prevail. Mm-hmm. And I saw that happen throughout my career, that there were times we went places with the president, mostly overseas, where the president was supposed to do X, Y, and Z. And in that program, we realized that the Y portion wasn't as secure as we would like it to be for whatever reason. And we were able to talk to the chief of staff and the president, and they would agree not to do it. So we've had that happen before. But the protocols are, look, this wasn't like there was a medical emergency. There were shots fired. So the protocol is, hey, we're not going to stick around and talk about it and keep our fingers crossed and hope that there's not a secondary attack. We're going to go back to where we're safe and secure at the White House.
Really good advice there. Yeah. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.